Book 2, Part 1 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, Volume 1. Translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Beaudrib. Book 2. A.D. 16 to 19, Part 1. In the consulship of Sestinus Statilius Tarsus and Lucius Lebo, there was a commotion in the kingdoms and Roman provinces of the East. It had its origin among the Parthians, who disdained as a foreigner a king whom they had sought and received from Rome, though he was of the family of the Arsacids. This was Vonones, who had been given as a hostage to Augustus by Phraates. For although he had driven before him armies and generals from Rome, Phraates had shown to Augustus every token of reverence, and had sent him some of his children, to cement the friendship, not so much from dread of us, as from distrust of the loyalty of his countrymen. After the death of Phraates and the succeeding kings in the bloodshed of civil wars, there came to Rome envoys from the chief men of Parthia, in quest of Vonones, his eldest son. Caesar thought this a great honor to himself, and loaded Vonones with wealth. The barbarians too welcomed him with rejoicing, as is usual with new rulers. Soon they felt shame at Parthians having become degenerate, at their having sought a king from another world, one too infected with the training of the enemy, at the throne of the Arsacids now being possessed and given away among the provinces of Rome. Where, they asked, was the glory of the men who slew Crassus, who drove out Antonius, if Caesar's drudge, after an endurance of so many years' slavery, were to rule over the Parthians? Vonones himself too further provoked their disdain, by his contrast with their ancestral manners, by his rare indulgence in the chase, by his feeble interest in horses, and by the litter in which he was carried whenever he made a progress through their cities, and by his contemptuous dislike of their national festivities. They also ridiculed his Greek attendance and his keeping under seal the commonest household articles. But he was easy of approach, his courtesy was open to all, and he had thus virtues with which the Parthians were unfamiliar, and vices new to them. And as his ways were quite alien from theirs, they hated alike what was bad and what was good in him. Accordingly they summoned Artabanus, an Arsacid by blood, who had grown to manhood among the Dahae, and who, though routed in the first encounter, rallied his forces and possessed himself of the kingdom. The conquered Vonones found a refuge in Armenia, then a free country, and exposed to the power of Parthia and Rome, without being trusted by either, in consequence of the crime of Antonius, who, under the guise of friendship, had inveigled Artavasdes, king of the Armenians, then loaded him with chains, and finally murdered him. His son, Artaxius, our bitter foe because of his father's memory, found defense for himself and his kingdom in the might of the Arsacids. When he was slain by the treachery of kinsmen, Caesar gave Tigranes to the Armenians, and he was put in possession of the kingdom under the escort of Tiberius Nero. But neither Tigranes nor his children reigned long, though, in foreign fashion, they were united in marriage and in royal power. Next, at the bidding of Augustus, Artavasdes was set on the throne, nor was he deposed without disaster to ourselves. Caius Caesar was then appointed to restore order in Armenia. He put over the Armenians Ariobarzanes, a Mede by birth, whom they willingly accepted, because of his singularly handsome person and noble spirit. On the death of Ariobarzanes through a fatal accident, they would not endure his son, having tried the government of a woman named Erato, and having soon afterwards driven her far from them, bewildered and disorganized, rather indeed without a ruler than enjoying freedom. They received for their king the fugitive Vonones. When, however, Artabanus began to threaten, and but feeble support could be given by the Armenians, or war with Parthia would have to be undertaken, if Vonones was to be upheld by our arms, the governor of Syria, Creticus Silanus, sent for him and kept him under surveillance, letting him retain his royal pomp and title. How Vonones mediated an escape from this mockery, I will relate in the proper place. Meanwhile the commotion in the east was rather pleasing to Tiberius, as it was a pretext for withdrawing Germanicus from the legions which knew him well, and placing him over new provinces where he would be exposed to both treachery and to disasters. Germanicus, however, in proportion to the strength of the soldier's attachment and to his uncle's dislike, was eager to hasten his victory, and he pondered on plans of battle, and on the reverses or successes which during more than 3 years of war had fallen to his lot. The Germans, he knew, were beaten in the field and on fair ground. They were helped by woods, swamps, short summers, and early winters. His own troops were affected not so much by wounds as by long marches and damage to their arms. Gaul had been exhausted by supplying horses. A long baggage train presented facilities for ambuscades, and was embarrassing to its defenders. But by embarking on the sea, invasion would be easy for them, and a surprise to the enemy, while a campaign too would be more quickly begun. The legions and supplies would be brought up simultaneously, and the cavalry with their horses would arrive, in good condition, by the river mouths and channels, at the heart of Germany. To this accordingly he gave his mind, and sent Publius Vitalis and Caius Antius to collect the taxes of Gaul. Silius, Antius, and Caecina had the charge of building a fleet. It seemed that 1,000 vessels were required, and they were speedily constructed, some of a small draught with a narrow stem and stern and a broad center, that they might bear the waves more easily, some flat-bottomed, that they might ground without being injured, several furnished with a rudder at each end, so that by a sudden shifting of the oars they might be run into shore either way. Many were covered in with decks on which engines for missiles might be conveyed, and were also fit for the carrying of horses or supplies, and being equipped with sails as well as rapidly moved by oars. They assumed, through the enthusiasm of our soldiers, an imposing and formidable aspect. The island of the Batavi was the appointed rendezvous, because of its easy landing places, and its convenience for receiving the army and carrying the war across the river. For the Rhine, after flowing continuously in a single channel, or encircling merely insignificant islands, divides itself, so to say, where the Batavian territory begins, into 2 rivers, retaining its name and the rapidity of its course in the stream which washes Germany, till it mingles with the ocean. On the Gallic bank, its flow is broader and gentler. It is called by an altered name, the Vahal, by the inhabitants of its shore. Soon that name too is changed for the Mosa River, through whose vast mouth it empties itself into the same ocean. Caesar, however, while the vessels were coming up, ordered Silius, his lieutenant general, to make an inroad on the Chatae with a flying column. He himself, on hearing that a fort on the river Lupia was being besieged, led 6 legions to the spot. Silius, owing to sudden rains, did nothing but carry off a small booty, and the wife and daughter of Arpus, the chief of the Chatae, and Caesar had no opportunity of fighting given him by the besiegers, who dispersed on the rumor of his advance. They had, however, destroyed the barrow lately raised in memory of Varius's legions, and the old altar of Drusus. The prince restored the altar, and himself with his legions celebrated funeral games in his father's honor. To raise a new barrow was not thought necessary. All the country between the Fortaliso and the Rhine was thoroughly secured by new barriers and earthworks. By this time the fleet had arrived, and Caesar, having sent on his supplies and assigned vessels for the legions and the allied troops, entered Drusius's fosse, as it was called. He prayed Drusius's father to lend him, now that he was venturing on the same enterprise, the willing and favorable aid of the example, and willing and favorable aid of the example in memory of his consuls and achievements. And he arrived after a prosperous voyage through the lakes and the ocean as far as the river Amisia. His fleet remained there on the left bank of the stream, and it was a blunder that he did not have it brought up the river. He disembarked the troops which were to be marched to the country on the right, and thus several days were wasted in the construction of bridges. The cavalry and the legions fearlessly crossed the first estuaries in which the tide had not yet risen. The rear of the auxiliaries, and the Batavi among the number, plunging recklessly into the water and displaying their skill in swimming, fell into disorder, and some were drowned. While Caesar was measuring out his camp, he was told of a revolt of the Angrivari in his rear. He at once dispatched Tertinius with some cavalry and a light armed force, who punished their perfidy with fire and sword. The waters of the Visurgis flowed between the Romans and the Cherusei. On its bank stood Arminius with the other chiefs. He asked whether Caesar had arrived, and on the reply that he was present, he begged leave to have an interview with his brother. That brother, surnamed Flavius, was with our army, a man famous for his loyalty, and for having lost an eye by a wound, a few years ago, when Tiberius was in command. The permission was then given, and he stepped forth and was saluted by Arminius, who had removed his guards to a distance and required that the bowmen ranged on our bank should retire. When they had gone away, Arminius asked his brother whence came the scar which disfigured his face, and, on being told the particular place in battle, he inquired what reward he had received.
Flavius